Thank you, everybody, for sticking it out to the very last talk. I know that lunch is next, so I will hopefully make the wait worth it. My talk today is called Architecture as Text, and there was sort of when I submitted the talk, there was a really long sort of tagline to it that was describing setting up AWS infrastructure on easy mode, which is what I'm going to teach you today. So as mentioned, I'm Angelina Fabbro. You can find me on that Twitter thing at HopefulCyborg if you want to chat about something today or just follow photos of my cats, things that I'm making or doing, all that kind of stuff. And I am a principal engineer at a company called Small Winds. And at Small Winds, we are building a Slack app, a Slack bot actually, called Begin, that adds some very intuitive tasking to Slack. And so what's happening in this GIF right here is our CTO, Brian, who's also here, is sending me a task saying that, like, to give a great talk on Arc, which is what we're going to talk about today, and I've decided to accept that challenge. Hopefully I can check this off later, since it does specify it has to be a good talk, or kick-ass talk. And then also I follow that up by adding a to-do item for myself too. I was debugging some issues getting things out of an S3 bucket. And so that's the thing that we're working on. And in order to build this cool tool, we decided very early on to invest in a lot of the products and services that Amazon offers, including Amazon Lambda. We definitely use S3 for assets on our website. We're using DynamoDB, API Gateway. So we were very new in adopting this stuff in the Amazon ecosystem. And back then, there weren't really a lot of good tools for configuration and deployment. How many people here have ever gone into the AWS console to set up a Lambda or API gateway? Okay, that's actually more people than I thought, which is great. How many of you have ever done that with all the commands to connect everything at the command line? Was that a good experience? Oh, actually, okay, cool. I mean, like, okay, if that works for you. But here's the thing, and it absolutely might work for you if you have maybe a couple of Lambdas that you're managing. So in preparation for giving this talk, I was talking to everybody at Begin. I was like, okay, I was talking to Brian. I'm like, how many Lambdas do we have? And I did a poll on Twitter just to get informally some idea about how many people are managing. Because for us, we ended up using so many Lambdas that it became a challenge to do things through the console or through the commands, remembering them every time. You can use a bash script to set up those commands for you, but we wanted something that was a little bit more automated. So we built a tool for that. And this poll, the result was that more than 50% of people have more than 20 of these like endpoints and Lambdas that they're working with. At Begin and at Small Winds, we have over 500. So all of our API is Lambdas. All of the Slack bot commands are Lambdas. Everything that we do, including the serving up the website that this screenshot is from, is using this infrastructure. And so you might be asking yourself, like, what the hecko is this serverless thing that people have been talking about, right? Because, like, what does that even mean? People told us there's this cloud, but come on, we all know there's no cloud. It's just someone else's computer. And the thing with serverless is that, spoiler, they're still servers. You just have nothing to do with them. So I say that serverless is really not a great way to describe what is actually going on in these metaphors, but rather functions as a service. And that is still a little bit vague, so we're going to do a metaphor. So imagine that, okay, it's back in the day, and you want to host a website on the internet, and in order to do that, it's got to have a little home to live in. It's got to have a little web server to serve up your content from. And so you can kind of think of that server, the physical machine, as like a house. Generally only like one family, one application, or maybe one person lives in that house, and it kind of does one thing. It houses the application, like it serves it up maybe. You can have other things on the server too, I guess, but for the sake of this metaphor, just pretend. And so then eventually, we moved into this paradigm where, it was more cost effective and made more sense to have somebody kind of manage some elements of that server for you. And also that it actually, for most of the applications out there, you don't need to have the full resources of an entire machine. And so we got into this model that I like to call kind of like apartments, this idea of virtual private servers, or the cloud is sort of like, you've got these hypervisors managing the allocation of machines to create a virtual private server sort of instance for you. And that to me is kind of like being in a house with roommates, right? Like there is one house, you've got multiple applications, multiple operating systems kind of side by side doing what they need to do to serve up multiple web applications. And that's been our way of doing things too. And so if we take this one step further, imagine that you don't need to necessarily, you don't need that space all the time. In fact, even just being a roommate in someone's house, like maybe you're just not there that often, right? So we can move to this metaphor of hotels. So functions as a service is kind of like saying, I don't want to manage even having an apartment. I only want a room when I really need to get some sleep. And in the case with functions as a service, essentially what's happening is you're saying, okay, I'm trusting Amazon to abstract away the notion of a server altogether. You do not have to deal with load balancing. You do not have to deal with maintaining the environment at all. You just have some code that you bundle. You literally zip it up and send it to Amazon. And when your endpoint is hit, that code gets executed once. And there's a little bit of persistence between code execution. You can do things like have a sessions table, and there's some things in the environment that will kind of stay the same. But essentially, it's like fire once and forget. And it's a very different way of doing things. I mean, the key benefit I just sort of touched on is that you have less ops and infrastructure stuff to worry about when it comes to like with Begin, we're going to be opening up signups to everybody very soon for this thing that we've worked on. And we decided that this infrastructure was probably good for us because one of the things that people struggle with when they've got an influx of activity is their site or application falls over. And I don't know, I feel like Amazon's big enough and kind of understands what they're doing, fingers crossed, that that's not going to be a problem for us because of this on-demand sort of scalability thing. So hopefully it helps you understand serverless, or rather functions as a service, a little bit better. Because for me, it took me a little while to wrap my head around it. I was like, but there's still servers. Like, why would you call it that? And really, it's because the unit we're talking about is just sort of changing at this abstract levels. We're talking about functions rather than the whole web server. So this is a diagram of, and this is the thing, right? So you might be thinking okay, that sounds cool. I want to build something with it. How am I going to do that? You might think I'm just going to go into the Amazon control panel and set up a Lambda. But it turns out you kind of need a bunch of other moving parts in order to do anything meaningful. And the architecture we're going to look at today is what is going to be provisioning all of these things with a tool that we built called Architect in order to abstract away the configuration management sort of parts of this. So how this would work is you type in mycooldomain.biz. Essentially, you've got Amazon Route 53 working with these hosted zones to deal with the name servers for your domain, and eventually that all gets routed to Amazon API Gateway, which honestly at a high level you should really just think of API Gateway as this is routing in front of all my little functions that I've got set up. And then it goes and your Lambda executes, and maybe that Lambda then talks to S3 or DynamoDB and does the work that it needs to do. So there's a lot of steps here. And without tools to manage this, you have to go in to the control panel and set it all up manually, or you have to use something like the command line tool, which is actually a very powerful tool, but then in order to automate, you kind of end up wrapping that in bash scripts or something else and doing that work. So I like this quote. I actually borrowed this quote from somebody else. And we've got these great solutions for scalability, but essentially because they're so new and relatively untested, they kind of cause us these other problems. And that problem is this configuration management and our deployment story. So traditionally, this is handled with this idea of infrastructure as code. Usually that means something like you've got a manifest describing what you want. It's checked into version control. That's often versioned with versioning your infrastructure along with your code. And there's probably some tools to manage that. It's usually a command line sort of binary that you use in order to manage it. And so I mentioned earlier that when we started doing this, we were very new. I mean, Amazon and this Lambda stuff was, they were just rolling it out. So there weren't a lot of tools to do this. I mean, there were a couple that sort of came onto the scene as we were building our own thing, such as Terraform, serverless, which, way to be extra confusing. These folks, like, their company is named serverless, and then, like, the thing is serverless, which is another reason to maybe call it functions as a service, because I found that confusing. So there's this one called serverless, and there's AWS SAM. I never remember what SAM starts for, so I just think it's a person. And they do configuration in a few different ways. In Terraform, in order to configure, like, an endpoint with a Lambda in sort of that model that I showed you, and actually only a few parts of that model, you would probably end up writing something like this. And what does this look like, right? I mean, if you've written even a little bit of JavaScript, you might think to yourself, yeah, okay, that's very JSON-like. So essentially, you've got to write some JSON in order to describe these Amazon primitives, and then Terraform will set those up for you. And this one right here is essentially just a simple Lambda. So writing JSON by hand in order to create this configuration file. And then this serverless and also SAM has a very YAML style way of doing things, right? So this is all the stuff you have to write in this example for writing. Yeah, so this one is, let me remember. Yes, this one is 2 functions. You've got a users create and users delete Lambda, 2 of those. And also some, we've got like a DynamoDB table that they're going to talk to. So all of this YAML you need to write in order to get these 3 things running. And to me, I don't know, I'm starting to feel like that's a lot. So if we look at AWS, what they provide and what they suggest, these, like templates that they've got going on, it's YAML-y, it's just very long. And I feel like the Amazon one is the most terse. Like, they want you to specify, like, you're essentially you're describing, like, the stuff that you do in the control panel. I really feel like it's very explicit about what Amazon resources you want to make. And I find all of this super stresses me out, right? Because when you've got to deal with provisioning and managing 500 of these, or even more than 20, because more than, with the poll, more than 50% of people have at least more than 20, that's a lot of time, right? That's a lot of fiddling in a control panel and a web UI and taking away from you doing the ops and programming tasks that you care about. So, so there's some issues with this, right? That there's deep proprietary knowledge required. You have to know about the Amazon primitives, these resources, and how to describe them in the config, which is specialized knowledge. You are essentially committing these incantations, this arcana, into your code base as a part of your code base. And when it comes to the ways and the tools that you're using to write it, JSON, like, I know we all get kind of used to staring at it, but it's not great to write by hand. It's unforgiving if you mess that up. There's no comments. Like, what's up with that? I think YAML's a little bit better if I had to pick between the 2, just because you get comments. Both of them, I think, can be probably equally bad with the nesting, but YAML gets called out here for that. And then there's also some very human elements to this too, right? Because I'm a firm believer that reducing cognitive overhead, not even believer, there's like, you can like look this up, there's like real science behind this. If you reduce cognitive overhead for the amount of stuff that people have to keep in their mind, they can focus on the 1 or 2 things they need to do really well. And I think that's a guiding principle for me when it comes to designing tooling and even choosing which tooling that I consume. So I want something, I always ask myself, is this going to be easy to read, understand, or reason about? Is it fast to get to the first deploy? I don't want to feel like this when I'm in the middle of trying to get something done. That discourages me from using a tool. The fun and the whimsy goes away very quickly. How fast, this all impacts how fast we can onboard new devs and ops on our team, and regardless of level, whether they're junior and writing their first production code straight out of school, or from teaching themselves, or somebody who's really, really senior and just trying to evaluate technologies to decide what is right for their company or for their organization. And I like to ask myself, okay, so how many people here have ever been on call? Okay, how many people are on call right now? Oh, I'm sorry. There's always one. I'm really sorry. My heart goes out to you. And I like to ask myself, what would be the worst possible thing that could happen? And if I'm going to be having to push code on a Friday night or in the middle of the night and it's an emergency, what am I going to want somebody looking at? What do I want to be looking at? I want something that is easy to understand, easy to reason about, and that I can change and get the deploy out the door as quickly as possible. So I think, like, how is this going to feel when I'm panicked and looking about it in an emergency deploy situation? So, you know, at Small Winds, we started moving away from this idea of infrastructure as code, because the code and just like having to read it like that is, it's terse, it's awkward when you're dealing with the config management. And we moved toward this idea of designing a manifest that describes architecture, but in a text, in essentially very human-readable form. So I'm going to describe to you today that Arc is a plain text manifest file. And with this manifest file, you're going to describe an application. You install some tools with Node at the command line, and then some magic happens. And the magic that happens is with that architecture diagram I showed you earlier, it sets up and provisions all of these resources that are going to get us today in a demo from buying a domain all the way through to serving up a web page in just a couple of minutes with all of that architecture so that you can build a scalable application. So an Arc file is a plain text manifest file, and it's designed to solve these problems that we just talked about. This here is an example of probably, this is like the hello world of Arc files. And just to describe what you're looking at, and then we'll go and write one together, the sections that start with @ everything after them becomes an instruction for generating AWS architecture. The app directive defines a namespace, and you'll see when we're looking together in a few minutes in the AWS console that that namespace scopes everything essentially as a prefix for all the resources that get automatically created, which means that if you do go to the control panel, searching for stuff related to your app becomes really nice and easy. And HTML, it defines some routes. You'll notice that we had a get there, so there's one single route. And that's it. That's enough to make a web application and deploy it on Lambda. So we're going to do a demo, and if you decide to, you're following along at home or something, or you decide that you're following along here, you will need an Amazon Web Services account and your credentials set up on your development machine in these locations. And if you don't have that file, you can create it, and it looks kind of like this. It's kind of nice because you can divvy up between your work and personal and stuff like that. And once those credentials are in that location, we're going to use them to authenticate and deploy to Amazon. So let's do a demo. Let me get over to my example here. All right. Okay, so for this demo, I wanted to really start from scratch and kind of show the whole process. So the first thing that we do is we actually go over to Route 53, which is Amazon's domain services, and we're going to buy this sweet domain of existentialdread.click, because honestly, naming things is very hard. What I'm not going to show you is me typing in credit card details or filling out the registrar information, because not only is that dangerous, but it's also boring, so that was really easy to do a hard pass on. And then what we're going to do, video's going to go. Okay, and then what we're going to do is we are going to go to the command line, our trusty friend, and we're going to create a directory for our project. And of course, we're going to pop into that directory and start doing some stuff. We're going to be using Node modules, and our project's written in JavaScript, so we're just going to do the quick npm init, just yes to everything. And then we're going to install architect workflows. And these modules are the ones that essentially have all the logic in them that abstracts away the individual commands and stuff you need to specify for setting up Lambda, for setting up your routes, your API gateway, for connecting your Route 53 domain, with the domain name servers. And so that's installing now. And it should take, there we go, that's not so bad. And then what we're going to do is we're going to create that Arc file we were talking about. So we know that our namespace, we should probably keep it simple, right? Let's just make the namespace existential dread. And then we have a domain directive because we bought ourselves a domain but moments ago, existentialdread.click. And we're going to keep this very simple, right? We want a minimal example. So we're just going to do one route of a get for HTML. And then we're going to write that and quit. Now, there's one more step we've got to do, and only once on this project, thankfully, as we've got to go in and we're going to specify for npm that there's some special Arc scripts that we want to have commands for that we want to run. And you can see that I've specified a keyword for my profile. That goes back to the configuration file that we made earlier. And it also has just a few things for Arc create and create, DNS, and deploy. And so what we're doing now is we are doing Arc create. And what this will do is, based on the Arc file, it will go and create a Lambda, and it will also create a sessions table, which is optional for you to use for managing state in between your function runs. And that will be done in a second. And I've got this On the right-hand side here, I've got the Amazon console, just so that I can refresh and show you that, yes, I am not full of crap. It did indeed create these 2 lambdas. There's 2. There's a staging and a production, because it's just good habit to do most of your experimental work on a staging or dev branch, and then graduate that up to production as you fix bugs. We are going to go rogue today, though. I will be pushing directly to production, so kids, do not try this at home. And you can see there that these 2 lambdas were created but moments ago. So we pop back over to the command line. And now what we're going to do is Npm Run DNS. This was one of the scripts that I specified earlier. And what this is doing is automatically looking at that domain directive and doing all the work behind the scenes for you to connect and get some name servers going and stuff like that. So that's all ready to go now. And now we're doing hello world, but I bought the domain existentialdread.click. So when you create the new lambdas, there will be like a skeleton with an index.js all set up for you to go that you can just edit and serve up whatever you want if you choose. So I decided to make this a little bit more on theme. So I'm going to save that, just return some HTML. And now I'm going to do arc deploy. And what's going on here with this variable is you always deploy to staging by default, unless you set an environment variable to be otherwise. So we're going to push this directly to, oh, and we're done. That's it. We've deployed. So we're going to go over to my browser and then try and load up existentialdread.click. And here we go. OK, it's spinning. OK, well, that's anticlimactic. Why is it just spinning? Well, I got to this point in filming this demo, right? Like I did this screen thing, and I went through all the commands, or screen flow sort of thing, and recorded it. And it started spinning, and I was like, oh my god, what did I do wrong? I'm going to have to like redo this part and edit the video, and I don't like working with iMovie, and it's 11 p.m., and you know what I mean? Like I was super butthurt about it. But then I realized that the twist here is actually really cool, because we'd gone so quickly from buying the domain name all the way through to this point, the domain name the name servers hadn't propagated everything fully. So we were like, this is like less than 5 minutes, and it took a little while. So if you go on your phones now, this is going to ruin the Wi-Fi. If you go to existentialdread.click, in fact, we can go do that together. Group activity. Yes, there we go. And we have served up a simple, very, very simple website. And I feel like I probably should have popped in that architecture again for review. But we've essentially got all that stuff deployed for us all along Amazon, which means that it doesn't take very long to get going. You don't have to sit and go through the Amazon Kitchen Sink UI and try and find all that stuff, which honestly, like the first time I went through it, I was lucky. I had somebody teaching me, and they're just like, I'm sorry in advance for this. There's just a lot going on, and like you got to go to this corner and click this thing, and I'm just like, I'm super glad that we built this, because it abstracts away a lot of stuff. So what's amazing about this is that deploys are now really fast and boring, which is kind of what you want when you're on call. You want to be able to fix that quickly, and you want it to be uneventful. So I'm actually really pleased with that as far as workflows go. OK, so a couple more things, and then we can all get to eating some food. This is a project that we made at Small Wins, but we gave it to the JS Foundation so that it is not tied necessarily to, like, its continued existence is not tied to our company's existence specifically, because we see the potential here for this to help a lot of people get into this paradigm of their architecture. It is Apache 2 licensed, which I am not a lawyer, do not take this as legal advice, but for a lot of folks at larger companies, sometimes your law people are concerned about patent clauses, and so Apache 2 might be for you. There's no intermediary. Some of the solutions out there will require you, they'll be like, yeah, we'll take care of your configuration and your deployment, but you have to sign up for an account, and they kind of end up as a service in between you and Amazon. And if that's something you're concerned about or don't want in your stack for whatever reason, our tool is good, because there's none of that. There's you, there's the credentials, and like we just take care of like kind of automating that stuff for you, right? And as for a tiny roadmap, right now, basically, this is all JavaScript, because we made it for our use case, which is very much JavaScript up and down the stack. And we are working on adapting those workflows to other languages. Most likely, we're going to do Python first, just because I've been doing some Python stuff, and I've got a good excuse. And also, the automagical creation of an S3 bucket and static asset uploading. Right now, that is not automatic, but I bet you there's some websites with static assets out there, so that seems like a pretty high priority to me. And that's it. Thank you for your time, everybody. I hope that was helpful. And if you have any questions, come talk to me after.